Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you to University Express Erie County Senior Services free lifelong learning program for older adults. Thank you for being here tonight. Senior Services mission is to connect older adults with local resources that meet their unique needs. They offer so many great programs and services, there's truly something for everyone. Some examples include the Stay Fit Dining Program, which was the dinner that was served earlier, as well as nutrition counseling and frozen meal pickup. If you're looking for health and wellness programs, we offer Club 99 here at the Akron-Newstead Senior Center. That's Mondays at 12:30, and that's a free exercise program run in area senior centers. And they also have RSVP, AmeriCorps Retired Senior Volunteer Program. Senior Services also offers case management services, including health insurance counseling, transportation, home care, family care assistance, and they help you determine eligibility for things like SNAP and KEEP. We have the number in the office if you ever need the number to contact them. A few more quick announcements before we introduce our speaker. University Express now uses a key tag sign-in process for class. If you don't have one, you can register with the county to get one. If you are a member of the Senior Center and you're registered, we have your key tag to scan for you. University Express is now available in 26 different senior centers and libraries throughout Erie County, and there's no membership required to access any of those 375 classes. Out of respect for our speaker and guests, we ask that you please silence your cell phone. I also want to just point out, this is a live feed tonight, which allows people at home to listen with us. They are seeing the slideshow that you're going to be seeing. They're not seeing you, but they will be able to hear you because there is a microphone that picks up Doug's voice as he speaks, but it will also pick up any extraneous noise. So let's try to keep that to a minimum. So I would like to introduce our speaker. Doug Kohler is a local historian and author who has written extensively about early Western New York. In addition to teaching at Clarence Middle School, he has served as the Erie County historian for the last 14 years. He has degrees in history and education from Canisius College and Pace University, and he's currently working on his doctorate at the University of Reading, England. He has written 5 books on Clarence and edited the Hull House Bicentennial book. Additionally, he writes frequently for Western New York Heritage Magazine. In 2011, the Buffalo and Erie County Historical Society honored him as the O&B Augsburger Award, with the O&B Augsburger Award, which recognizes local historians devoted to the preservation of Erie County heritage. And now I'm sorry, Doug doesn't use the microphone because of his teacher voice.
Do we have one you want me to use? This is what I do for a living. Are you okay if I forget my 7th grade points? Awesome. Great, thanks. Good evening. It's a pleasure to be back with you this evening. On such an interesting weather night. I drove from pouring rain into, I thought for a moment, blue skies to a little intermittent precipitation here. So I appreciate you coming out in the rain. And apparently we've gone back to April for temperatures. So there's that. Normally when I do University Express, I share with you either my research or something I'm working on or something I've been working on. This one is a little bit different. The University Express staff came to me last session and said, would you be interested, could you do for us a presentation on how the Buffalo Bills got their name? Yes, I could do that. But then I thought it'd be, as I started in my mind to figure out what does that look like? How does that presentation go together? I thought we'll get there. So first off, you've been with me long enough to know that it's a meandering path over the next hour. We'll get to the Buffalo Bills. Yeah. But I thought it'd be kind of fun because to get there, we got to talk about some other things like where do some of, there's a lag here. Hold on.
There's a little tiny lag.
Could be me, could be the remote, could be because it was working literally 2 minutes ago.
Okay, once. There you go.
Okay, well, if I can't get it to,
I'll click if you.
up now it's back, now it's going, okay, I think we're there. Okay, the only hitch is for me, I can't put my laser pointer on the screen. So, and since we're live streaming, I guess that's just as well. So I was thinking, if we're going to talk about the Buffalo Bills, we really need to go and talk more broadly about where some of the names around here come from. So that's going to be the theme. That's what's going to tie, meandering hour together. And you'll, as we go, that's where that name comes from. I'll point some out. Some may just pass by and go, That's where the name comes from. So that's kind of the thinking. But if we're going to wind up with the Buffalo Bills, pass through Buffalo Bill Cody in the Wild West shows, we really need to start with this whole idea of where does the name Buffalo come from? And if I get asked any one question that really comes up time and again, as county historian, it's where does our name come from? So I thought we'd take the first couple minutes, because if this is about Buffalo, we need to unpack that. So we're going to start with the ones we don't think are right. You're going to think, why don't we just go to the right one? We don't know exactly where the name Buffalo came from. The Buffalo History Museum, and Cynthia Van Ness, who is the research librarian, has a web page. And if you're interested to find it, let me know. It's easy to access through the page about all of the theories that have been floating around for about 150 years about where Buffalo got its name. And some we like better than others. Some, like this one, we're going to dismiss fairly quickly. But this is the one, the both flew theory is the one that sticks around over time. And I have a theory about why that is. Because we can see this one, right? It's a visual. You can see the Frenchman standing with the big boots, and sword, and he's got the hat with the big ostrich feather plume, right? He's standing on the Niagara River, he's watching the current go by, pulls his sword and says, "Oh, mon Dieu, que beau fleuve." Wow, what a really pretty river. That's what it would translate. And so we like that because there's a visual that goes with it. We can see him standing there. And we know the French came through here. On your right, as you're looking at this, that's the frieze. So at the Buffalo History Museum, when you go up onto the second floor, in the archways, there are the panels of moments of Western New York and Buffalo history. And this is the one right at the top of the stairs. And it is Beaufort. It's LaSalle and the Griffin, and the indigenous people are pushing out their canoes, coming out to see the Griffin sail off into the sunset, heading west to disappear. And that's a whole other story about what may have happened to that shift in time. But here's the problem. While it's a good visual, and we know the French were here, they didn't put anything on a map that said Beaufort, the pretty river. In fact, they called the Niagara the River aux Chevaux, the river of horses. There was also not a river named Buffalo. We'll come back to that in a minute. So there's no evidence that that's what they call it. Right? It's not there. And so while, the restaurants call Beaufort, and we talk about this is one we sort of dismissed as, very picturesque, but probably not historically accurate. So, what about these guys? Well, this is a little more problematic. My wife is such a good sport, living with a historian. We were on a tour at Fort Niagara, and we were walking towards the French castle, and the docent was talking to the group, and we were kind of trailing back. The docent, I just perked up, and the docent said, "Well, it's called Buffalo because there were thundering herds of bison." And I went, my wife goes, "Don't you dare." I'm like, "But," she goes, "Don't you dare." So, this one is a little, no, but. So why do we say no, but? There is evidence that the American bison has something to do with the naming of where we live. In so much as the Native Americans would have had an understanding. Let's go back in time. Last fall when I was talking about Lewis and Clark, it's estimated that when Lewis and Clark went west from St. Louis, there were in the neighborhood of 50 million bison on the Great Plains. Now, what's interesting is that I said this in the fall, I'll say it again, Lewis and Clark saw the West in a way nobody else did. Because as soon as they got back to St. Louis, men in their expedition went right back out into the Rocky Mountains as trappers, as traders, and they began to change the West almost immediately. Certainly, the bison is one way in which that change is evident, because over the course of about 100 years, so Lewis and Clark is 1806, by 1889, scientists were of the belief that the American bison would be extinct by the year 1900. Now, if you've been west, this is a picture I took of these two guys out in Yellowstone a couple of years ago. If you go to Yellowstone, it is like going to a Bills game an hour before kickoff, except what is holding up traffic are actual buffalo. Those, when they get in the middle of the road and they have no sense of which side of the road to be on, traffic stops. And it's really cool. to see them up close. So that idea that somehow the bison would go extinct, luckily never came to pass. By 1890, there were already efforts to, save the last, they estimated no more than about 1,000 bison in the West. Today, that number is, hang on, just let me double check on my notes, that now there are about 400,000 bison. And then about 130 of them are, I don't know if we'd say free range, but are, the majority are in national parks or like Custer State Park in South Dakota. There's even a state park in Western Illinois that has its own herd of buffalo. But there are about 130 that aren't as confined to the national parks as some of the others. So that, luckily, never came to pass. Now, what's that have to do with us? Well, here's what we think. This is a book published in 1889, or a map from a book published in 1889, about the American bison by the scientist named Hornaday. So the map is referred to as the Hornaday map. Let me point out a couple of things you're seeing. So here, this lighter red line was the original range, estimated range, of the American bison. There are two types of bison, the Great Plains bison and the Eastern Woodlands bison, which was a little bit smaller, which is where our part of the story comes in. You'll notice in the West that there are those blue lines, and that if you get really close, you can see there are numbers inside. Those are the estimated numbers of bison that were still there in 1889. And you can see that those numbers are pretty small. But let's dial in on where we are for a second. All right, so there's our corner of the map. Now you can see not only the pink line of the original range of the American bison, but those numbers inside our last sightings of bison in those areas. So for us, here in Western New York, we're looking at right after the American Revolution. Now, you're looking at the map going, but see, there were bison right up here in Western New York. Look at that little spike in the map. Because we think that Hornaday was following, taking some urban legend as scientific fact. There were accounts that the bison would range as far as Buffalo Creek, to the salt licks that were up there. But here's why we have to be cautious with this as a way of buffalo getting its name. Because if buffalo, the animal, the bison, ranged as far as Buffalo Creek, which is not that far from where we are, what would you expect to find? Bones. Bones, precisely. There is no paleontological evidence of bones north of Allegheny State Park. So, while Hornaday draws the map to include us, probably not. That said, there is evidence that the bison did range as far north as the state line, well, which wasn't state line back then, but Allegheny State Park. So here's why that's important, because the guy at Fort Niagara, no, there were never thundering herds here in Buffalo. But what it means is that the Seneca Indians would have had contact with, an understanding of the American bison. So when somebody said that guy looks like a buffalo, that would have made sense to the Seneca, because either in their own travels or in the Seneca trade all the way into central Pennsylvania, all the way west to the Mississippi, they would have encountered bison, not right here, but close, and would have had an understanding, a word in their language, which they did, and an understanding of what a buffalo, an American bison, looked like. And that's where we think we're going to get to a more documentable source of where the name comes from. All right, I think if there's anything else I want to mention about buffalo. Oh, yeah. So if you get down towards Erie, so we said there is no creek or river named Buffalo here in Western New York. I know we call it Buffalo Creek today. Get back to that in a second. But the French did. There was a river in just south of Erie, Pennsylvania. They called the Rivière au Bœuf, the River of the Buffalo. So they're close, but probably not here. Now, speaking of Buffalo Creek, there's a real, I do have to say, I like working with the TV. That is some of the sharpest image I've had in any place I've ever had a chance to speak. So you guys are getting like the A game here with this. This is one of the, accepted as the earliest image of what that area of Buffalo looked like in about 1810, 1811. As I said, without my pointer, I'm going to slip over this way. So on this side, that would be like the terrace. Okay, so if you think of like where the Skyway is, where I can say this to you, the odd was My students look at me and go, what odd? You know, you're with me. So the odd would have been up here, and then from there, there is that terrace that dropped down to where Canal Side is, the Naval Park is. So that would all be right in here where this gentleman of European dress is sketching the mouth of Buffalo Creek. On this side, we have a totally inaccurate teepee, but clearly Native Americans on the south side of Buffalo Creek, which is where the Native American reservation would have been, the Buffalo Creek Reservation. And then as you look out the creek, the fort at Fort Erie is evident over in the background. So, what did the Native Americans call this? That is a little bit more unclear. There is some evidence they called it Beaver Creek, because you've got to think back in the time there were beaver here. The cool thing is we were out at Tift a couple of years ago, and there are trees that they've got like chicken wire around, because the beaver will come out and destroy the trees. So while beaver had been trapped out by the time Europeans arrived here in Erie County, they are making their way back as a native species. Every now and then, right over here, I teach middle school, we get accounts of beaver in Ransom Creek, back behind the school. So they're making their way back. So there are some accounts the Indians called it Beaver Creek. You think, but we don't call it Beaver Creek today, and we don't. But here's where it gets a little sticky. The Native American, the Seneca word for beaver, the Seneca word for buffalo, had a very similar ending. So there's a lot of thought that what the Native Americans call Beaver Creek starts to get mistranslated. We're going to see that again in a minute, where the two words get inflated. But I love this. That's a great image, even if lots of the pieces aren't exactly historically accurate. Here is a much more accurate view of that. This is only a couple of years later. A similar view, now from the top of the terrace, so where these two guys are here on the right, that would be like where the terrace is. There, you can see the staircase leading down. They're looking at, right here is the mouth of Buffalo Creek with this larger ship. And then in the left foreground, there's a little boat with some soldiers in it, and a picket fence. That would be Little Buffalo Creek, which comes in just east of where the Naval Park is, or would have back in the day. And this is right around the time of the War of 1812. So we think this is about 1815, 1816, certainly in the time before the Erie Canal. The Native American reservation on the far side, the village of New Amsterdam, as it was called at the time, eventually Buffalo on the side, sort of where we're looking from. Now, I put this one in because this is probably the most likely theory about where Buffalo gets its name. Because as we said, on this side of the creek was the Seneca Creek, or the Buffalo Creek Reservation. And accounts were that at the mouth of Buffalo Creek, where it flows into the lake, there was a log cabin. And it was occupied by a Seneca who people at the time say was big and shaggy, wait for it, like a buffalo. And so, because they said it looked like a buffalo, and the creek flowed in front of his cabin, they called the creek Buffalo's Creek. Okay, now you're thinking, well, why do we like that better than the Frenchman with a sword or a thundering herd? Because that's what settlers did back in the early days of Buffalo in Western New York. That's how they named things. Skajackway Creek was named after a Native American who lived where Skajackway Creek hit the Niagara River. In North Buffalo, near the North Park Theater, there was a creek called Cornelius Creek, named after the Cornelius brothers. Now, it's been built over, but the creek was there back in the day. It's named after these two brothers who lived on its bank. In Lackawanna, there was a creek called Smoke Creek, and it was named for a Seneca Indian who lived on its banks, and they called him Old Smoke. So the creek became Smoke's Creek. So while it's not as picturesque or as exciting as the others, it does match more closely with what we know the settlers did in terms of applying names to things 200 years ago. So Buffalo's Creek, most likely, but I'm still going to run you through a couple of those. Here's another image, again, almost identical vantage point from the terrace looking down. Now it's 1825. The canal has come, you can now, sorry. I should just put it down. So you can now see the canal coming through here, commercial slip, the canal itself, and you notice all the change. The harbor light is now out at the end of the jetty. You notice all of the boats and the sails and the masts that are beginning to accumulate at the sort of what becomes the mouth of Buffalo Creek. It's about 18, so we've looked at 1810, 1816, Now it's about 1825 with that view, and obviously the village is beginning to build up. Now, this idea of mistranslation, seen a couple of spots. And I just want to this will start to move us west, finishing the idea of naming, but also as we begin to move west, start to move us towards eventually Buffalo Bill, the Wild West Show. There were a series of Native American treaty meetings that took place in New York State in the years after the Revolution. We think if that mistranslation exists or it gets reinforced, it's at the Treaty of Fort Stanwix. So Fort Stanwix is in Rome, still there as a National Historic Site in the middle of the city of Rome, New York. It guarded a portage. So we can talk at the end about what's coming to the Erie Canal. But we've been talking a lot about alternate canal routes. One of them was to go to Rome and then go north to Lake Ontario. We can talk about why they didn't like that as opposed to building 363 miles across New York State. But the American government called the Haudenosaunee to Fort Stanwix in 1784, the year after the Revolution, largely to chastise the majority of the Haudenosaunee nations for siding with the British during the war, and to kind of pat the Tuscarora and the Oneida on the back of being loyal to the United States. They also, while they had the Haudenosaunee there, forced the Haudenosaunee to sell off almost a third of northern Pennsylvania, sort of as a, this is what you get when you don't, stick around in the United States. It was not our best treaty moment in a series of not good treaty moments with the Haudenosaunee. But in the translation, the discussion, we think the translators for the federal government mistranslated instead of the place of basswood, because there were all sorts of basswood trees around, mistranslated it as buffalo. And so you've got the Seneca word on the screen. It makes not a lot of sense that we call it buffalo because there were a lot of basswood trees, not a whole lot of buffalo. But what this treaty does is it creates a growing sense of tension with the Haudenosaunee. So, about 10 years later, the federal government tried again. This time with the full intention that this treaty was about what they referred to it as polishing the chain. What they meant was the chain of friendship between the United States and the Six Nations. A couple of things about it. This is Griffin's painting of the treaty. So George Washington sent this guy sitting in the chair, this is Timothy Pickering, to come to Canandaigua and negotiate on behalf of the federal government. The goal really was simply to reinforce that, we got it wrong in Fort Stanwix. We are friends. We want this perpetual friendship. You can see in the back next to Timothy Pickering, there is a gigantic 6-foot-long wampum belt. It's called the George Washington Peace Belt. It takes 4 men to hold it. But again, it's everybody holding hands, that idea of we're going to fix things now. This friendship will exist across time. Perpetual peace and friendship is the language they used. I'd also want to point out, so in that cluster of men under the tree, you're going to find Red Jacket, Farmer's Brother, Corn Planter, all of the big names for the Haudenosaunee in the years right after the American Revolution. But if you notice, in the foreground, there are the clan mothers. So Haudenosaunee culture is, to this day, matrilineal, and the women of the clan still have the prerogative to remove a chief. I love the expression. It doesn't translate as well in English, but it's essentially to knock the horns off the head. So the chief wears a stoa, like this job. So a couple of these, this guy here. So it's like a tight-fitting baseball cap without a brim. It's got feathers on top. And the sachem, we would call them chiefs, but that's not quite the right term. The sachem have little pieces of deer meat that project right off the front. So when the women remove the chief, they literally knock the antlers from his head. And it's still done. The Tuscarora removed the chief a couple of years ago. So they're there. But the interesting thing is that, of course, there was a settlement, although no land was exchanged at this point, but sort of make up for what had happened 10 years earlier. But you'll notice piles and piles and piles of cloth. Because what the Haudenosaunee wanted at Canandaigua and through most treaties was a Scottish woven wool called stroud. Because even when it gets wet, it still maintains, it's better than anything else it would have had in the snow, the rain, the weather we had. So you see all of the gifts that the federal government sent to Canandaigua, these piles of strout. And the total value was about $4,500, which isn't a whole lot, obviously. Even, I'll do some what it would have been conversions in just a minute. But the interesting thing about the Treaty of Canandaigua is that every fall across the Six Nations, at every tribal headquarters, a UPS truck pulls up and delivers a box. And in that box is fabric. The same, well, it's not sprouting, but that fabric represents this treaty. Every member of the nation gets about 2 inches of that cloth. It isn't about the cloth, it isn't about the value, it isn't about the fact that we're giving them more than we gave 200 years ago. The arrival of that cloth says this treaty is still in effect. That every year the federal government sends to the Six Nations that cloth to represent the cloth that was exchanged to Canandaigua, and that treaty of perpetual friendship still exists. Now, I'd like to say that Big Tree is part of the next story, but it's not that Big Tree. Because the next treaty occurs at Big Tree. Now that's Geneseo, all right, at which point my wife cheers because she's an alum. But in Geneseo, there was a big tree. I need to give you the numbers on this one. Because on the bank of the Genesee River, the town of Geneseo, there was a gigantic white oak tree. It was 26 foot 9 inches around. That's why they called it the Big Tree. Now, in the southern part of Erie County, we have a road called Big Tree. If you follow it, it goes to Geneseo. It goes to the Big Tree one. The Big Tree is not there. It was washed out by a flood in, just want to double check on here, 1857. But you want to get a sense of how big it was, the Livingston Historical Society has a slice that's about 3 feet, 4 feet high, and the 26 foot around of the original Big Tree. And it was there in 1797 that the United States and the New York State especially created another treaty with the Seneca in particular. In this case, it was to take care of the land that we think of as the Holland Land Purchase. 3.2 million acres of land, essentially that's a 3.2 million football fields. Sight unseen. In exchange, the Haudenosaunee got a series of reservations across Western New York, from Niagara County up here with the Tuscarora to the Seneca Tonawanda Reservation, which is not far from where we are, Cattaraugus, Salamanca, Buffalo Creek, which of course is no longer there, Allegheny, and a series of reservation lands up the Genesee River, where Mary Jemison was, the Gardeau Reservation, and then they forgot one, which they eventually added later, and that's right there, and that's Oil Springs, which was originally left off, but where the oil bubbles up in that spring water, it was considered sacred by the Haudenosaunee. So they added it to the reservation lands they were given. Now, in exchange for selling 3.2 million acres and the 12 parcels of land that they got, the Haudenosaunee were also given $100,000 of stock in the First National Bank of the United States. If you're Hamilton fans of the musical, you know all about the founding of the First National Bank. You don't want me to hear me sing at this hour of the night. So if you haven't, go see Hamilton. Highly recommend it. That is essentially $5 billion today. Now, the federal government did not hand the Haudenosaunee $5 billion. What they did is they said, we'll give you $6,000 a year in perpetuity. So that stock eventually paid out. But again, there's never a good thing about any of these treaties. But one of the, I think, significant things is that it allows the Haudenosaunee, the Seneca especially, to be one of the few nations of Native Americans across the United States that still lives on some element of their tribal land. Right? They weren't sent west to Oklahoma, although, bring back for another night, we'll talk about that. There were efforts, especially with Buffalo Creek, to seize that land. One of the deals was, we'll give you land out in Oklahoma. Some of the Oneida took land in Wisconsin. So if you ever go to, what is it, Lambeau Field, where the Packers play? Right, just outside one of the gates, there is Oneida land, and wait for it, of course, a casino. But so there was some westward movement, but the majority of the Haudenosaunee were able to stay, at least on some elements of the traditional land. And that's significant when you look at the rest of the nations across the United States and how they were displaced. All right, now speaking of the land that we live on once upon a time belonged to Massachusetts. Now, that's always a little weird. We're like, how could that be? So if you look at all of the colonies going across, Georgia, North Carolina, Virginia, it's Virginia. But then Connecticut, Massachusetts. When they were founded, the kings gave them like lines of latitude, but did not give them a line of longitude to denote a western end. So a lot of these colonies, one of my favorite, because I got a good example on this, is Connecticut. So outside of Cleveland, I have a former student who is now at Case Western Reserve University, and we got talking about what the name means. I said, well, it's because that was Connecticut's Western Reserve. Connecticut had reserved all of this land, and especially here around Cleveland, where a man named Moses Cleveland led a whole bunch of settlers from Connecticut to found that area, as we call it Cleveland, and that land was part of Connecticut's Western Reserve. Most of that land was given up during the Constitutional Convention. Massachusetts, however, said to New York, no, not quite so simple. We're going to give it up only when somebody is willing to buy it. Yeah, it's about the money. I guess since the Constitutional Convention, we should say it's about the Benjamins because he was still alive back then. Right? So New York is going to eventually figure out how to get that land from Massachusetts. First, a pair of men named Phelps and Gorham bought the land. Now, if you drive the through, we're going that way. If you drive the thruway east, that way, just the other side of Victor, New York, the thruway takes a little dip. There's a water tower on your right. It says Phelps. That's named after one of the two land speculators. And north of the thruway, there's a town called Gorham. So their names stuck around, even though they weren't able to do anything with the land. They sold all of this land to a guy named Robert Morris. But to get the land to where it could then be sold to settlers, they needed to deal with the Native Americans. Morris couldn't do it either. He is at the Treaty of Big Tree, but he's selling to get out. Speaking of which, that's why the dam at Letchworth is in the town of Mount Morris. That's right. So Phelps, Gorham, Morris, they all leave their footprints. At Big Tree, the Holland Land Company is finally able to acquire the land. And this is what that purchase looks like. You'll notice that the towns on the northern end where we are, and the towns on the southern end are a little bit longer than, say, Eden, Boston, Colden, Holland. And there's a reason for that. Now, when we cross Tonawanda Creek today, we don't really think twice about it. But back then, 200 years ago, that was a pretty active creek, and it would have divided the land. So they were worried that if you cut those towns, Newstead, Clarence, Amherst, at their square, which is where they were surveying towns back then, 6 by 6, that you'd have a half town on this side of the creek and a half town on the other side of the creek. So the northern tier of towns and the southern tier of towns were extra long to make them more cohesive. So when you see that, that's why the county, especially on the northern southern edge of the town, the county, the towns aren't square. Now, Joseph Ellicott, Ellicott Creek, Ellicott Square, Ellicottville, Ellicott in the town, the county of, in Cattaraugus County, all get their name after Joseph Ellicott, chief surveyor of the Holland Land Company. He surveys the village of Buffalo. Now, I want you to take a good look at that. We understand that surveying form today because this would be Niagara Square. 143 and 149 would be where City Hall is. But I want you to look at some of the names. Because, yes, some of the names are still there, like Bustine Avenue or Casanova Avenue. But others, like Vollenhoven down here in the south, or Stadnitsky across the middle, or my favorite running at the diagonal, Schimmelpenninck, they're gone. As is the name. It's hard to find one, but Joseph Ellicott decided that he would get a little bit of favor with the bosses back in Holland by calling the town New Amsterdam. Nobody but Joseph Ellicott called the town New Amsterdam. However we got there, probably the guy living in the cabin at the mouth of the creek, people started to call it Buffalo. Those names that I just pointed out, those are the bankers who funded the Holland Land Company. So again, Joseph Ellicott was thinking, I'll slap their names up, get a little bit of love from the people back in Holland. You can also notice here, right along Bustine and Casanova, where it says terrace, that's that change in elevation. We could see in those earlier pictures. And why, there's Terrace Avenue that comes under the, where the odd used to be. Now, so looking at this, sorry, let me back one. So, slow down in winter. Okay, so if you look at that square and how everything radiates away, right, that is not a unique design for Joseph Ellicott because his older brother, we talked about last fall, training Meriwether Lewis to survey, was working with Benjamin Banneker and Pierre L'Enfant laying out Washington, D.C. So Joseph Ellicott saw what his older brother was up to, a map that looks like that. You notice all of the squares with the radial streets? Now, that's exactly what Joseph Ellicott did in Buffalo, but only had time to do the one because then the War of 1812 comes along and everything gets burned. But you'll notice the similarity in design. He borrowed it from what his brother was doing down in Washington. Now, speaking of, this is what Buffalo looked like in about 1812. All right. While many of those names we looked at are gone, so now you'll see Schimmelpenninck, which I'd love to still have that on the map. Okay, is now replaced by Niagara. But a lot of the cross streets, especially those that bear Native American names, those do still exist. So Huron, Mohawk, they're still there. Clinton, of course, named after DeWitt Clinton, the governor who built the Erie Canal. On the left, as you're looking at it, that is the original sketch done by a man named Juba Stores of what Buffalo looked like on the eve of its burning in 1813. You'll notice here so then I put up the line drawings because they're a little bit easier to see. There are some buildings. You'll notice here it says Stone Jail. That's important. St. John House is going to be over on, well, of course I can't. Oh, here it is, St. John Tavern. And the blacksmith shop are, according to legend, the only 3 buildings that survive. My thought on the burning of Buffalo is that it was kind of an etch-a-sketch moment. Again, a reference I can use with you, my students like a lot. So, like the shake it moment, because work on the Erie Canal, at least discussion of an Erie Canal, had begun before the War of 1812. Of course, it was then delayed, by the war. But the citizens of Buffalo knew by 1813 the war was winding down, that when the war was over, the canal work would pick up full speed. And the burning of Buffalo allowed them to rebuild in a way that would position Buffalo to be the western end of the Erie Canal. Though Black Rock, just up the river, wanted it, Buffalo was this was a chance for them to rebuild with the facilities to really be the western end of the canal. Plus, Albany to Black Rock isn't really as much fun to sing as Albany to Buffalo. So, and if you want to know more about why Buffalo, not Black Rock, have me back in the fall to talk about the Erie Canal. All right, let's go west. So we're moving west. The Erie Canal opens up the west in a much more significant way because now goods flow east, people flow west. And once you get to Buffalo, lake steamers are going to carry them all the way out to Minnesota, right? All the way to the Mississippi and begin to open the west. And this guy here, this is Frederick Jackson Turner. And in 1893, he tried to distill for Americans what the frontier meant. And he decided, and again, first off, let me back up on language. I work with a lot of Native American educators, a lot of Native American historians. Language is problematic. We use terms like pioneer, settler, frontier. That works, but it doesn't work for Native Americans because all of that suggests, Turner's thesis. And like this drawing here, westward goes the course of empire, painted by the same guy who did Washington Crossing in Delaware. They've made it to the top of the mountain. They're looking over the pass, and what they see before them is just empty land. And so they're going to break through the mountains. They're going to pioneer into this land and settle it. That's a view, but it's not an inclusive view. So I'm going to kind of use traditional language, but language is something we need to be very careful of when, to make sure we're being fair to what that period of history looked like. But Jackson said the frontier was what defined America. This is a time when America is still trying to figure out what it's all about. National parks are a thing because we don't have pyramids or coliseums or Gothic cathedrals, but we have land like nobody else. So America is still trying to figure out what defines us. And for Frederick Jackson Turner, it was the frontier. And America's constant from the time the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock and the settlers of Jamestown, it's a westward challenging of that frontier, even if the reality is it's not a frontier, it's a borderland. And along that borderland, you have interactions with Native Americans. But that's not how they saw in 1893. So Jackson said, American democracy was not born of a theorist's dream, was not carried on the Susan Constant to Virginia, nor the Mayflower to Plymouth, It came out of the American forest and it gained new strength each time it touched a new frontier. So to Jackson, this is what makes America unique, that pushing of the frontier. And as it moved, it created certain characteristics that he saw as quintessentially American. Things like, this whole idea of taming the frontier, that it promoted independence, it broke down social barriers. We just finished women's rights in my 7th grade history class. We were talking about the fact that the first place that women had the right to vote was in the West. It was in Wyoming in 1870. And that makes sense because as you moved west, you didn't have time for the conventions of the East. If women only could do these jobs and not all the jobs, everyone's going to die. So women, those social barriers broke down out of necessity. And we see that first, and then that change sort of moves back east. An encouraged invention. John Studebaker invented what? Studebaker, the car, right? But did you know he started during the gold rush making wheelbarrows? He was called Wheelbarrow Johnny when he got to the gold country during the gold rush. And he got there, and like so many others, thinking he'd get rich finding gold, he never did. But like Winchester and Levi Strauss and many others, the money wasn't in the gold, it was in selling things to the gold miners. And nothing was more important to a gold miner back then than wheelbarrow. So he made his money in wheelbarrows, decided the wheel was the way to go. Eventually, we think of Studebaker and eventually the car. So invention is an important part of that moving west. Over time, Turner's thesis, there's still people that, we still study it in history. We understand the limitations. There are others who will extend it though and say by 1890, the federal government declared the frontier closed. In the census of 1890, there were now people that had filled all of the land coast to coast. But what happens in 1898? We start a war to increase and expand our empire. So there are a lot of people who look at it, sort of taking the Turner thesis. When the land frontiers were closed, we began to look beyond and expand an empire, and it was part of this idea of sort of manifest destiny, challenging the frontier, that it was, sort of by another name. All right, so let's get up to our namesake here, perhaps, or the namesake of the Buffalo Bills. William F. Cody. It is hard to tell you what is real and what is not, because the one thing William F. Cody was a self-promoter, whether it was with his stage show, with his Wild West show, with his autobiography. So we know that he was born in Kansas. The family moved to Iowa. There are strange local connections because it's Buffalo. I think everything is 1 degree from Buffalo. His father was born in Ontario in 1811 before they moved on to the Great Plains. And actually, we'll double back. Buffalo Bill Cody lived in Rochester for 2 years in around 1875. That one took me a little bit of time. Rochester? I'll tell you that story in a minute. His father died at a young age. And Buffalo Bill, not yet, well, Buffalo Bill, of course, went to work as the breadwinner for the family. And he started as a drover, so driving cattle for the wagon trains from Iowa, Kansas. We've still got pathways, the Oregon Trail goes west, the Santa Fe Trail goes southwest, there are cattle drives across Kansas. And that's where he originally cuts his teeth. But now here's the problem. In his autobiography, he tells people that, during this time, he went up the Platte River and was a fur trapper. That's probable. Then he says he went west to California during the gold rush. Probably not. I shouldn't say probably not. Historians have been unable to document any of that. Most famously, of course, he tells of being a Pony Express rider. That on his way, to the west, he ran into a Pony Express rider and became so enamored of that life that he took time out and became the Pony Express rider. Now, hard to get a sense of that because the Pony Express only lasted about 18 months. Because no sooner were these guys going from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California, than right behind him came the guys on the right stringing telegraph poles. And this is the Pony Express cutting through that Chimney Rock in the background, Nebraska. Near Council Bluffs. Yeah. Possibly he was a Pony Express rider. If he participated in a gold rush, he was what's called a 59er, going to Pikes Peak, the gold rush in California, probably not all the way out to the famous gold rush in California. What we do know, though, is that by the time the Civil War broke out, he was back in Kansas. And in Kansas, we were just talking about this today in my class. In the years prior to the Civil War, Kansas had its own version of the Civil War. Kansas-Nebraska Act made it so that whichever side had more people in Kansas could vote to be either free or slave. And Buffalo Bill Cody's family, they were free soilers. So he was what we call a Jayhawk, which is why the Kansas Jayhawks, if you're a college basketball fan, I guess. The Jayhawkers were free soilers. They did not want slavery in Kansas. They were opposed to the bushwhackers or the border ruffians who were pro-slavery people in Kansas. And so as the anti and pro-slavery people flooded in, they began to kill each other in a 10-year preview of what would become the American Civil War. Buffalo Bill Cody was involved as a Jayhawker in raids against the pro-slavery people centered in Potawatomi, Kansas, and in later life regretted sort of that he'd been drawn into that. But that leads him eventually into a more formal setting with the cavalry during the Civil War. And it's just after, still dressed in his Civil War uniform, that he meets his wife in St. Louis. That's a whole nother story, a whole nother can of worms. Apparently she tried to poison him a number of times, at which point he then filed for divorce, but then retracted. So, not germane to where we need to go tonight. Interesting though, nonetheless. And so from his time as a drover, from his time as a Jayhawker traveling on horseback, he gets, and then in the cavalry with the, allied with the Union Army, that's where he meets Philip Sheridan. Speaking of which, Sheridan Drive, named after Philip Sheridan, the Civil War general. But it's there that he gets pulled in by Sheridan after the war as an Indian scout. And that's kind of, where he begins to make his fame across the Wild West. It's also during that period in 1866, just after the Civil War, that he gets hired by one of the railroad companies. So by 1866, the transcontinental railroads are going full speed. And as they build across the Great Plains, they need food for the workers. So Buffalo Bill, hence the nickname, in the course of about 18 months is believed to have killed 4,280 buffalo. That seems to be fairly well documented. He would take the carcasses. There was a camp that sort of followed him. There they would process the meat, turn it into buffalo hams, and then provide it to the railroad workers. It's a little less sustainable is that he claims during one day to have shot 48 buffalo in 30 minutes. If you do the math on that, even with a repeating rifle, that still seems a little suspect. But again, as I said, it's really hard because all of these, he throws all of this out in the biographies, and then we're sort of left to sift through what may or may not be true. But this is part of that, why the buffalo reached a point where by 1889, scientists thought they were going to be gone. That pile of skulls on the left is about 15,000 buffalo skulls. Wow. What's interesting is, we talk, there's a number of reasons for the herds that decline. One obviously is an intentional hunting to feed the railroad workers. An intentional hunting to deprive the Plains Indians of food. One is as domesticated cattle moved west on the plains, especially to Kansas and Iowa, they brought with them bovine diseases that decimated the buffalo herds. And the buffalo, the bones, but they used the buffalo leather. So the hides were sent back to Chicago, where they were processed and cut into leather belts, not this kind of belt, but like machinery belts. So they would use them and string them because that buffalo leather was so durable and so tough. Those were the pulley belts that drove the Industrial Revolution in Chicago and other cities on the upper Great Plains. So a variety of reasons the buffalo were hunted literally to that close, the edge of extinction. And Buffalo Bill Cody obviously played an important part in that. It was on the Great Plains that he met Wild Bill Hickok before Wild Bill was in Deadwood with the Dead Man's Camp playing cards. And a guy named Texas Jack Omohundro. And they were invited by a promoter in Chicago named Ned Funtline, who was doing a stage show, the famous Scouts of the West. And of the three of them, of course, Wild Bill wound up in Deadwood dead. Texas Jack didn't really stick with it long. But Buffalo Bill found an allure to the stage show that was different than anybody else. And that really became, in addition to all those things he may or may not have done up to that point, really where his fame comes from. On the right is a picture of Buffalo Bill and the Wild West Show as they enter the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. In the Wild West Show, and the Wild West Show traveled, people come and go. We'll talk about a couple of more famous ones in a minute. But what they did is Buffalo Bill would recreate famous scenes. In this one, this is the Battle of Summit Springs, which he engaged in as a scout for the 5th Cavalry under General Sheridan. So he would reenact that. And then, there's an it factor here, I'm sorry. He would come out on stage with a feather bonnet, with a war shield, and a scout. But that's what drew people. It was sort of this fascination of the dying West, of, sort of how the West was being conquered. And that's what drew him. After Custer's death, the Little Bighorn, they would reenact those sorts of scenes. And so the Wild West Show traveled with 15 head of cattle, elk, horses, Native Americans, and they traveled not only all over the United States, but to Europe. He played before Queen Victoria, just about every country in Europe that you can imagine. In Edinburgh, Scotland, there's a statue of a cowboy on a bucking bronco, and that is because Buffalo Bill and the Wild West Show played Scotland one year. And gets all sorts of acclaim. But of course, for us, I want to keep the story a bit close to home because he's coming to where? Sure, into the Pan American Exposition. So, yeah, I love that. I love that. Okay, it's the fact that Buffalo here is giving him the side eye. Yeah, you Buffalo Bill here. Okay. So Pan Am already had an Indian Congress. So there was it's fascinating because you read this, and this is actually part of my doctoral work. People came to, let me restart that. Pan Am and all those World's Fairs, Chicago, Buffalo, ones in Omaha, all the World's Fairs up to World War I are really problematic because people come to get educated, but not in a way that we would find acceptable today. There are Hawaiian villagers, Philippine villagers, Eskimos. There's an exhibit called Darkest Africa where they literally went to Africa and recruited pygmies to come portray their life. It isn't something we would find acceptable today, but people in Buffalo, it was like the Discovery Channel. They weren't going to have a chance in their lifetime to encounter these cultures. As poorly as they were portrayed, as racist as it was, people were drawn because they perceived an educational element. And the same thing is true with the Indian Congress. So if you look, the suggestion here is that all Native Americans were the same, right? You've got everything from, the Six Nations of the Haudenosaunee to the Sioux. What really fascinated people right up to World War I were the cliff dwellers, the American Southwest. So there was this village, an amalgamation, because of course the Sioux lived very differently than the Haudenosaunees, but different than the cliff dwellers of, the Navajo. But, they all portrayed Indian life. And then there was a stadium here. So you see on the backside, the stadium, there were seats. Most afternoons, there was a sham battle. Sometimes, like Buffalo Bill, they portrayed, there we go, a specific event, like the Battle of Summit Springs or Custer's Last Stand. But almost inevitably, the Native Americans would get the upper hand, look like the Native Americans were going to win, and at the last minute, the cavalry would come in, vanquish the Native Americans, and all would be well. That's the story that people coming wanted to hear. This is actually the Pan Am Stadium. So on the back end of the Pan Am Midway, there was around 12,000 people, the largest stadiums in the country at the time. So some of the sham battles took there, and Buffalo Bill knew that these World Fairs were a captive audience. And so in August of 1901, he rolled into town with the Wild West Show, set up right across Elmwood Avenue from where the Indian Congress was on the Pan Am grounds. And actually, if you look at the picture on the left, the guy in the white hat with the beard is easily identifiable as Buffalo Bill Cody. He visited the Indian Congress, set up shop, brought the Wild West Show, Annie Oakley, Frank Butler, and they performed just across Elmwood Avenue from the Pan Am grounds throughout the summer. But in September of 1901, what happens to Pan Am? McKinley is shot, and so he quickly reads the tea leaves, packs up, and leaves Buffalo before the run was over. Good decision or not, hard to tell, because many of the days of better attendance to Pan Am actually were after McKinley's death. But Buffalo Bill took his chances, and if I remember right, headed to New York City while the whole McKinley thing was still unfolding here. With him is a trick shot, or in the Midway show, trick shot artist. She called herself Princess Winona. Her actual name was Lydia Smith. So she, for much of her life, portrayed herself as an Indian princess. She was supposed to be the daughter of Crazy Horse and a white woman born in the Dakota Territory. She was actually born in a pair of Quakers in New England. What she found is that she was a very good trick shot. And so she originally joined Buffalo Bill's show, traveled with him, but then when Annie Oakley joined the show, Annie Oakley didn't want any competition, so she booted Princess Winona, booted Lydia Smith, and then she reinvented herself as Princess Winona, traveling with Fred Cummings in the Indian Congress, no longer with Buffalo Bill. So that's her on horseback there doing a trick shot. And it's also important, so she's here in the center. So this is Princess Winona, and this is Geronimo, who was a federal prisoner during the time of the Pan American Exposition. You could come, he would sign things, he would take pictures, but all of it at a cost which benefited him. Not a bad gig for a federal prisoner at the time. And that's on the Pan Am grounds. So how does this link us back to Buffalo? So let's get to the Buffalo Bills. When the Bills organized, that's important to realize that our iteration of the Buffalo Bills was not the first iteration of the Buffalo Bills. There was All-American Football Conference that predated Ralph Wilson, our current Bills. And they were owned by an oil man named James Broyle, and he ran a competition to name his team. And a man named James Dyson won the competition, $500 for having won the entry, because he said a football team in Buffalo would be like having a thundering herd of Buffalo Bills, meaning 52 Buffalo Bills stampeding across the field. And so that's where the name came from. When Ralph Wilson bought it, the team, he decided to keep the logo. Now, I was excited to find this because in our house, or when I watched football with my dad, who just turned 85, whenever we played New England, he was, so we're playing the Boston Patriots, right? Because back in the early days, so here's the, so I love this one. So here's the, if only this were Tom Brady. So the poor Patriot, he's got this little bitty cannon, right? And here comes Buffalo Bill riding the buffalo with steam coming out of his ears, right? So that's the whole thundering herd of buffaloes. So follow that thread for a little bit. When the AFL formed in 1959, Lamar Hunt, who was, we're going to say it a lot in the next 10 minutes, Kansas City Chiefs, was recruiting owners. He approached Ralph Wilson. Now, if you've lived the history of the Bills like I did, we constantly lived with the threat. I mean, Wilson, he did good things, but we always lived with the threat that he wanted to move the team. Because right from the beginning, Buffalo was not his first choice. He wanted to put it in Cincinnati, St. Louis. He really wanted to go to Miami, but Miami would not take, they'd had an All-American Football League franchise. Didn't want to go, that had been a failure. They wouldn't let him play in the Orange Bowl. So eventually, after courting a number of other cities, he sent a telegram to Lamar Hunt that said, "Count me in with Buffalo." But it now launches the beginning of the Bills as we think of them here in Buffalo. These were sort of golden years. Now they predate my time. But of course, you've got two AFL champion seasons in 64 and 65. But on January 1st, 1967, stop me if you've heard this. In the year that did, in fact, host the first Super Bowl, the Bills won the league and went to play Kansas City and lost 31-7 to the Chiefs, who then proceeded to lose to the Green Bay Packers. Now, so good years, but it's a roller coaster. In between, there's sort of this down period. Now, this also, of course, as I remember at the time of OJ, right? And it took me a while to unpack this picture because this is 1973. But I'm thinking, well, but in 1973, they weren't playing in the rock pile, they were in Rich Stadium by then. So why was OJ breaking? And then I realized that, to do my research, the record was broken in New York City when he set the rushing mark in 73. And we'll talk about stadiums in just a minute, because if all goes well and the tech works, I'll take in a flyover to the new stadium. But this was sort of the last of the good years. I remember this must have been in like 1974, 75, maybe 76. I was in Cub Scouts. We had like sports night, and each of the 3 levels of Cub Scouts got a team, and you had to like get everybody to get on board with your team. So, one group had the Sabres, that was like the French Connection era. Those were really good years. One group had the Braves. They perennially made the playoffs. They always used to lose to the Boston Celtics. And we drew the Buffalo Bills, who were in the middle of a lull between OJ and Jim Kelly. It was a pretty long period. And we had to like try and sell, it was a cornerback named Tony Green. And boy, did we get stumped by the Bills and by the Sabres and the Braves. When Steve Tasker was signed into free agent, I think it was signed from Houston, he likened being picked up by Buffalo as going to Siberia, both the weather and at that point, the fate of the team. But of course, that was the beginning of that sort of next golden era of, Jim Kelly, Bruce Smith, Thurman Thomas. That's all the golden era Hall of Famers, except guy in the end, Shaw. I always want to say Artie Shaw, that's not right. Billy Shaw, thank you. My wife's like, Artie Shaw was the jazz musician. No, that's my notes. Right. So, but all the others, of course, that, that Hall of Fame group. And of course, I can tell you where I was for the first one. Can also tell you where I was for the second, this past January. But of course, what do we do with those? I know right where I was sitting. I was on the arm. You don't even know where I was. But, we lived those 4 years. I couldn't tell you where it was for the other 3. I watched them. But that moment where it all hung on Scott Norwood's foot. And then, of course, I can tell you where it was for this. Home run throwback. You want to go down the rabbit hole, get on the internet and check out some of the mathematicians who tried to decide if that was a forward lateral or not. So if you don't remember, it was 2000, January 8th, and the Bills were up with like no time on the clock, but they had just scored, had a kickoff to the Tennessee Titans, and they threw a series of laterals that eventually, surprised beat the Bills in heartbreaking fashion. But the question remains to this day, was it an illegal, was it a forward lateral, which would have nullified the play? And you can go online and all sorts of people with, Pythagorean theorems about was it a forward lateral or not. But it doesn't ease the heartbreak of, it's just another one of those moments. There were good moments. I can tell you where I was for this as well. I was in Florida, unfortunately a family funeral, but we were all watching the game because it was 70 and we were all wearing shorts and we were watching the Blizzard game. It's awesome, which the Bills won in overtime. I'm fascinated by this. Full disclosure, I'm a Doug Flutie fan. I would have preferred Flutie over Rob Johnson, and we've got at least 3 boxes of Josh Jackson covered. I always think they'll be fun when we buy them. I don't know what we're going to do when we get to a baker's dozen of them, but they're there. Where was for that one too. But here's a funny story about this. So that had to have been like the 2nd or 3rd week of January. That February break, we took the kids to Disney World. We'd stayed for the fireworks. It had to be like 10:30. We're headed out down Main Street, Disney World, towards the monorail. And as I'm walking, I hear the one guy over here. So 2 guys were talking inside the street. He goes, 13 seconds. I just can't believe it. I'm like, I can't get away from it. Here I was in Florida, 2 guys talking about the Bills' loss 3 weeks later in the middle of Florida. Now, a couple of interesting things. So the rock pile was built as a WPA project. Expanded when Ralph Wilson bought the Bills, because I looked at this image and went, wait a minute, it had the awning, right? So this section was covered. When Ralph Wilson bought the franchise at first, they expanded it to take the seating up to 46,000 seats. About 10,000 seats were added in the renovation. But when it became, when the AFL and NFL merged, the rule was you had to have a stadium that seated 50,000 people and they couldn't change the rock pile enough to get 50,000 in there. Of course, the rock pile, even after the Bills left, was the home of the Buffalo Bisons. I'm a Canisius grad, so I remember going, back when we had a football team. The Golden Griffs football team played there. But after the Natural was filmed in '83, there was a gradual, '87, the Bisons leave for Pilot Field. '89, my Griffs left the Destin Sports Complex where we play today, and then gone. But I do think, if you've been down there, if you know that stretch, the entranceway here, this curve, has been preserved as part of the John B. Wiley Sports Complex. And we drive by it every Sunday. We go to Westminster down on Delaware. And, driving by that, even though the rock pile's gone, to have that piece of it as a legacy was pretty important. Now, because they needed 50,000 seats, Ralph Wilson said to the county, I'll give you two choices. Build me a new stadium or I will leave. Okay, told you that becomes a running theme, as disturbing as this. You want to go to Seattle? I understand we have weather, right? Seattle. Right. He also looked at Tampa, and then eventually the county's like, we'll get right to work on a new stadium. And so they began building what I think of as Rich Stadium, then the Ralph and Highmark Stadium. Interesting that when they began it, there was also a plan in place to have a dome stadium in Lancaster. But the dome stadium, they decided would be too close to Lancaster High School. So ultimately, they canceled that plan, but the Bills had a long-running lawsuit to settle with the developers the dome stadium. I don't know that I wanted in Lancaster, but when we were having the last debate about where to put the next stadium, I really favored a dome down on the waterfront. But the problem was, and I get it wasn't just putting the dome on the waterfront, but then you'd have to literally rewire all of the infrastructure around it, including the skyway and all of that. So it isn't just the cost of building a dome stadium on the waterfront, but it would have been almost double to do all the infrastructure to feed that. You would have had to have, eminent domain, the land, it just would have liked a dome stadium on the waterfront, but it was not to be. One last thing about Rich Stadium real fast. When the Rich company bought the naming rights for $1.5 million in '73, that was one of the first naming rights for a stadium in the United States. Of course, now everybody's got naming rights on the stadium. Interesting that they wanted to call it Coffee Rich Stadium. Luckily, that's not the name they went with. So, and then to the home of the Bills now, as it's going to be. So these are some of the artistic renderings. The seating will be not as much as you think, 61,000. That's not insignificant, but certainly not among the bigger stadiums in the league. The cost is $1.7 billion, and the plan is that it will be open for the 2026 season. Now, as we wrap this up with just a couple last thoughts, the company that is designing it is the same company as design company called Populous Design. They're the ones who did the Manchester City Stadium in England at Etihad Stadium. And as you look at this, my favorite rendering, and then I'll take you over in the flyover, is this idea that in the plaza out front, there should be large statues of buffalo, which kind of loops us back all the way around to where we started. And the guys on GR were talking about they should be like the largest buffalo statues in the United States. That's not going to be really practical. You get out to Wisconsin, there's some really big bison. So if you haven't seen it, the Buffalo Bills did a drone flyover of the new stadium on April 15th. And this is kind of where it is. Now, if you haven't seen it, construction is ahead of schedule. So you'll notice that as we're looking at it on the right, there is now structural steel that's in place. That was not anticipated by April of, 2024. But because we had such a mild winter, 7 feet of wet snow accepted, that really they're much further along than they anticipated being at this point. And if you don't follow Josh Allen on social media, it's worth going back to take a look, because when the Bills' schedule came out a couple of weeks ago, he did just a hysterical social media post from inside the stadium. He had like a folding chair and his golf clubs, and he was just waiting for he was supposed to be waiting for the stadium, but also waiting for the schedule to drop. It was really, really very funny if you get a chance to take a look at it. But that's what the new home of the Bills will look like when it all comes to pass. Oops, sorry. So here's where we are. Just a last thought. And I always like to leave my audiences with, if you want to know more. So here's what just some reading recommendations. you'll know more about Japan, and especially kind of the midway aspect of it. Some of the stories, Jumbo the elephant, Chiquita the doll woman. Margaret Creighton has a relatively new, it's like in the last 10 years, book called The Electrifying Fall of the Rainbow City. Julia Brickling has a biography out of Lillian Smith, Princess Winona, that is also relatively new, part of a gigantic series of 8 volumes on the history of Buffalo Bill, the Wild West show, the Native Americans, how they marketed it. Frank Christensen's book is also part of that. And if you want to know a little bit more about the Bills, Greg Tranter, who is one of our trustees of the Buffalo History Museum, and Bud Bailey, the newspaper reporter, have a couple of books out, but the one I would recommend is Buffalo Bills, an illustrated timeline of a storied team. So there are other things I always recommend City of Light for just a general Buffalo thing. But those are some titles that might interest you if you're thinking to know a little bit more about the stuff we talked about this evening. So, as always, I'm 10 minutes over time. I love the fact that this is the only place that's scheduled for me at 5:30, so we have a hard stop. Because they're like, Doug always goes overtime. So, are there questions? Anything? Otherwise, I'll assume I did a fairly comprehensive job. If you have something you want to ask about me, I'm happy to have it. And hopefully I'll see you in the fall for Erie Canal. We'll talk about what's going on at Canal Side, what's coming up in 2025 for bison. Thank you.